Welcome everyone. My name is Simone Farresin, and together with my partner we are the heads of a design office in Milan and Rotterdam called Formafantasma, and the curators of this edition of Prada Frames. I see in the audience many familiar faces from the last few days, so please excuse us if we are going to repeat a few things that you already heard in the last days. But I think it is important to give an introduction to the concept of Prada Frames for the people who did not attend the other sessions. Prada Frames is a symposium that investigates the complex relationship between the environment and design outcomes. Under a shared ecological lens and with a transdisciplinary approach, the symposium brings together designers, architects, curators, scientists, anthropologists, producers, activists, legal and economic experts. Considering many of you are here because of the Salone del Mobile, the International Furniture Fair, we thought it was pertinent to have a subject of this edition of Prada Frames, the one of the forest, the governance of the timber industry, but also to recognize forests beyond these categories and as a place inhabited by a multiplicity of species, both human and more than humans. We are obviously really happy to be here at the Braidense Library because, well, it is a wonderful location. But if you think, most of all, it is in a way a forest in itself, in the form of bookshelves made of walnut wood, in the form of the chairs you're sitting on, in the form of the books made of paper fibers. This, of course, links and shows how pervasive the extractions of wood from forests is and how interesting it is and how much our lives are shaped by forests themselves. With the Braidense, we also collaborate in the selections of a series of books, many of which you probably spotted in the vitrines at the entrance. They are small selections of the many books dedicated, between other subjects, to the vegetal world. And I would like also to acknowledge the film that you've seen on screen while you were coming in the room. We want to thank, in fact, the Biblioteca Universitaria di Pavia that allowed us to film the Dendrografia in Suberica, which is also displayed at the entrance, which is an exceptional archive of wood specimens from this region of Lombardy, done in 1793 by Carlo Somaschi. In our morning session, we look at the criticalities of carbon offsetting, the governance of natural ecosystems, and the political forces shaping forests. In this session, we will explore modes of inhabiting and responsibly sourcing materials from the forest and indigenous knowledge, and feral dynamics. But now, let me introduce the first speaker of this last session of Prada Frames. Her name is URSULA BIEMAN. URSULA is a Zurich-based artist, writer, and video essayist. Her research-oriented practice involves fieldwork in remote locations, investigating the political ecologies of forests, oil, and water. She recently had a solo exhibition, Indigenous Knowledge Cosmological Fictions, at EMAMAC in Nice. Since 2018, she has been involved in the co-creation of an indigenous university in Colombia. We're also very appreciative of URSULA. We'll show us some video materials resulting from extensive and careful field research in the Amazonian forest. URSULA, please, the stage is yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Formafantasma, for this amazing invite, and thank you, Prada, also for making this happen. My practice lies at the intersection of art, ecology, and indigenous cosmologies. I will speak mostly about Forest Mind, a new video essay film in the Colombian Amazon. Several years ago, I made a video together with Paulo Tavares, who you heard speaking about this morning, on the Ecuadorian side of Amazonia, on related issues around the impact of large-scale oil and mining projects on indigenous lands and on the rights of nature which emerge from these territorial conflicts. In my new project, I'm focusing less on the geopolitical aspect of these disastrous developments in the Amazon. Instead, I'm exploring questions around intelligence in nature and in forests in particular. There is a lot of new science in microbiology and plant neurology that helps us better understand this emerging field. For my part, I was particularly interested in learning more from the indigenous communities about the kind of science they practice and how they imagine their relationship with the forest. And this relationship between humans and the natural world has a particular history in the Amazon. My projects in Colombia link back to the pivotal point where several historical temporalities converge. One of the timelines tells the story of the first European botanists making contact with the exceptional biodiversity of the tropical forests in South America and Colombia in particular. The thousands of specimens, observations, and data that the botanists brought back from their overseas expeditions became a major driver for the advancement of natural science in Western universities. The universities boomed. This is to remind us that the beginning of modern natural science is intimately linked with the project of conquest and colonization. This moment coincides with the rise of modern Western thinking and the removal of the clerical domination of the scientific establishment. After intense debates, the Church finally let Darwin's provocative theory of evolution stand on the condition that science would henceforth keep out of political affairs. With this, the relationship with nature was taken out of the public sphere and delegated to the natural sciences, where it was denied any sort of political agency. Within the context of colonialism, these philosophical debates had far-reaching consequences. Since indigenous people were considered part of the natural realm, they were placed in this scientific area short of any political agency. Their knowledge systems and cosmologies were quickly colonized, converted, and eventually delegated to the new academic discipline of anthropology. What I'm saying here is that indigenous people are put in a particularly vulnerable place, not only by colonization, but also by the premises of modern Western science and teaching. That is why my project in Colombia concentrates on the politics of knowledge.
Aquí no puede vivir como doctor o abogado, aquí puede vivir con conocimiento empírico, ¿cierto? Pero ese conocimiento empírico no es reconocido dentro de las escalas del sistema de las ciencias. Entonces, ahí ya hay un desequilibrio a nivel de reconocimiento y de justicia, con la norma, con la realidad. Entonces, ahí es donde empezamos a hablar sobre sujeto-objeto. Los empíricos son los objetos, ¿cierto? No son sujetos, no son reconocidos como sujetos, son los objetos. Entonces, ahí tampoco hay justicia. Y los abuelos siempre han dicho, el reconocimiento en nosotros como realmente expertos, porque son los expertos. Uno dice, ¿quién se inventó químicamente dos plantas que el chagropanga y el yagé estuvieran juntos, ¿cierto? Para que la combinación de estas dos pudiera usted volar a otro mundo o trasladarse a otro mundo. ¿Quién investigó más al bosque que un biólogo? Un anciano. Esa es la dinámica de la justicia, de entender este conocimiento en un marco, en un plano, digamos, de las ciencias. Yo digo de las ciencias.
My involvement in Colombia started a few years ago with an invitation from Museum Director Maria Belén Saez in Bogotá to go on a field trip to the Andean Amazon, an extremely biodiverse region. The south of Colombia had been closed off for several decades and had just opened up with the signing of the peace agreement. For a whole month, the leader of the indigenous Inga people took me through the region in his bulletproof car. At the end of the trip, he asked me if I could help him set up a university in his territories. That's how I became drawn into co-creating an indigenous university with the Inga people. I said yes because the project supports the much-needed paradigm shift from an extractive to a more imaginative and generative interaction with Earth and its natural life roles. And I saw it as a great chance to engage with indigenous knowledge systems. Biodiversity and epistemic diversity have co-evolved over millennia. They are completely entangled, so much so that if one of them dies, the other one also disappears. The ancestral knowledge of the forest is critical for the survival of the forest. So the idea for this university is to strengthen ancestral knowledge and to cooperate with Western science where they are compatible. It's quite a unique concept for a university. I was particularly touched by the idea that considering all the violence, political and economic pressures the Inga are facing on a daily basis, the community decided that it is a university that will make the difference.
La gran mayoría de nosotros como ciudadanos Inga, lo que hacemos, lo que reproducimos, es lo que no es nuestro, lo que aprendimos desde el momento del preescolar ahora hasta los doctorados. Y si estamos haciendo eso, estamos contribuyendo a profundizar una crisis que está viviendo el mundo desde lo que ha generado desde el conocimiento, en una ruta que se ha impuesto como algo que es lo más verdadero, lo científicamente probado. Y me parece que eso lo que ha hecho es ocultar las otras rutas de acceder al conocimiento, que en este caso son las rutas de los indígenas, de los pueblos indígenas. Y es una cosa muy fuerte, desde luego. Pero estamos allí. Y nos parece que tarde o temprano, de nuevo, esos traslapes tienen que quebrarse, tienen que transformarse. Porque es un tema que ha surgido bajo principios de violencia. Y en ese sentido es que nos parece que hoy por hoy es importante que el conocimiento impuesto y los conocimientos propios tengan un espacio de diálogo. Y ese diálogo no lo veo en otros contextos si no es en una figura que se dice es la universidad, aunque con el tiempo eso tenga que ir cambiando también de nombre. Pero por ahora, para hacer un poco más comprensible el mensaje en términos de lo que hay, voy a decir que es una universidad. Más adelante podrán decir que es una pluriversidad, una yachayhuasi, por ejemplo, lo que sea. Pero es lo que en este momento a lo que acudimos. Y ese tiene que ser un punto de encuentro de los saberes para reflexionar en cómo se apoyan, en qué van a construir, en qué van a retornar, en qué se van a regresar y dónde tienen que colocarse de nuevo en impulsos más propios, menos violentos, más sagrados, de tal manera que se pueda en principio, sobre todo, creo yo, respetar la dignidad, esa dignidad de la diferencia que cada uno es.
Art and video making are important in this project as a way of creating a visual and intellectual memory of this unique process of becoming university, but also by generating videos on the Inga knowledge and history, and for communicating the project within the community and with the world at large. I call this part of the project Devenir Universidad, Becoming University. The project acts as an initiator and aesthetic companion to the future university by creating exhibitions, publications, and online platform. A major task in the protection of an endangered culture consists in establishing a living audiovisual archive of the pluri-epistemic voices of the elders, healers, social leaders, traditional medics, and other forest beings. The archive holds many voices who remember the territorial history, how the missionaries came, to re-educate them how their ancestral land was rapidly sold off to large cattle farmers or licensed to the oil and mining companies. But there is also the memory of the knowledge of the plants and the wisdom of life. And this knowledge, whatever remains of it, needs to be protected because it is tied to the biodiversity of the forest. Devenir Universidad is a collective fabric where indigenous and Western knowledge traditions intertwine, nurture each other, and mutually transform with equal recognition granted to academic and indigenous researchers. To open a contemporary dialogue, we align with innovative approaches in the scientific fields such as ethnobotany, the anthropology of science, earth law and indigenous rights, environmental science and philosophies engaging with the life of forests and plants, all of which put forward ideas that are compatible with Amazonian cosmologies. Western universities would do well allowing for greater epistemic plurality at this time of dwindling biodiversity. What is becoming university is not so much the Inga people, but the territory itself, the living, sentient, cognitive territory. Because all knowledge comes from here, as the Inga say. Knowledge can only be produced in the encounter with the land and all the beings who inhabit it. It occurs while walking through the land. When their territories get destroyed in the Amazon, they don't just lose land, they also lose their ability to think and to know. That's why the university is not going to be a centralized campus, but a network of sites and paths, spreading across the vast territory where knowledge can be practiced in the form of forest learning, river learning, cloud learning, chagra learning. The notion of territory is central to Inga thought. That's the first thing we need to understand. Territory is not a delineated piece of land. It is a cognitive sentient unit that emerges from the ecological relationships between all beings who inhabit the space. This is perhaps the most fundamental difference between Western and indigenous thinking. In Western modern science, to know something well is when you can observe it from a distance, when you can measure, register, analyze, describe, and categorize it. From this perspective, territories are represented as a biophysical reality of sorts, that is a collection of plants, animal, mountains, forests, and rivers. Indigenous science conceives a totally different territorial paradigm. To know something well is to recognize its intentionality, and thus turning it into a subject where we can have a conversations between persons. We encounter the other as mind. This is from the workshops we did with the Inga in the territory to map their territory. And the authorities are always important in making decisions. My new video, Forest Mind, emerges from this long-term collaboration with the Inga people on their indigenous university. Forest Mind is about the intelligence in nature, viewed from a scientific and a shamanic perspective. From Western science, we have learned a lot in recent years about the ability of plants to sense, communicate, and take decisions. There is a growing respect for plants. But for indigenous people in the Amazon, this intelligence goes much further. A vital force permeates all that exists with invisible and visible entities, endowing them with awareness and meaning. The human mind spirit is in constant communication with these forces, and so are the plant spirits and animal spirits. There is an innate intelligence in nature down to the molecular level. Shamans in the Amazon practice the science of ayahuasca, a psychoactive plant that allows them to engage with this life energy. They consider ayahuasca an intelligent person, a plant teacher. She communicates through chemistry, and part of that chemistry are neural transmitters. Through a peculiar co-evolution, they happen to fit into the receptors in the human brain creating a unique mode of telepathic communication between the plant and the person who ingests it. It is the result of millennia of co-evolution, hitting precisely the part of the human brain that activates the sensibilities of perceiving, sensing, imaging. In Colombia, the shamans are called taitas. To master this science requires a long apprenticeship that involves the rigorous psychoanalytic process that ayahuasca sets in motion. Knowledge that is produced in this manner is bound to be subjective and thus cannot be replicated and transmitted on a large impersonal scale. The indigenous communities in the Amazon are deeply concerned because every time one of their old taitas is dying, a whole library goes up in flames. Every shaman has a highly specific knowledge that other shamans don't have. But they do share common premises. They have always insisted on the interconnectivity of all life. With the discovery of DNA in the 1950s, this also has been confirmed by Western science now. We are all made of the same DNA: trees, plants, insects, mammals, humans. We all are interconnected in this deep structural way. My intention with Forest Mind is to bring Western and indigenous science into dialogue in a contemporary way. How do each of them apprehend life? DNA is the code of life nested in every living cell. These DNA molecules emit light waves, so-called biophotons. It's in the ultra-weak light range, but with new instruments they are measurable. Hence, DNA are quantum. They consist of a material and an energetic part, which are entangled. It is the energetic part that holds the information, not the material one. The Amazonian medics have developed a technique that allows them to see and interact with this luminous, energetic part of DNA, which they sometimes call spirits. Taitas see with their mind rather than with their eyes. What they call spirit is closer to microbiology than religion. It might directly refer to the light source in DNA that interconnects life. For the longest time, indigenous science has been interpreted through the filter of the early missionaries who applied their own Christian concepts to what they observed in the indigenous rituals. As Western science advances, we are also accessing new levels of reading the traditional medicinal practice. Now, what is science doing in Colombia with regards to the tropical forest? Biotech companies have started with DNA sequencing the entire rainforest, breaking it down to the smallest fragments to be used as a source for the industries. Bogota has become the global hotspot for bioprospecting and biopiracy. But it didn't look like these corporations were eager to collaborate with me. So for this second part of Forest Mind, I started collaboration with ETH, the Institute for Science and Technology in Zurich. They have made a recent technological breakthrough in new ways of using DNA knowledge. So far, information is stored in the binary code 0 and 1. The new technology converts the digital code into the DNA code of ACGT, which is the 4 nucleotide bases. The DNA molecules are then stored in water in a small test tube, and in this form they are perishable within 6 months. The ETH technology consists in encapsulating them in microscopic glass beads so they become unperishable. In this state, they can be stored for eternity. And because it's written in humanity's own code, we will always remember it. So for Forest Mind, we made an experiment at the ETH lab. We took a sound file and an image file of the rainforest and a tiny piece of a real seed of a tree and converted everything into one single DNA code. The problem was that the outcome, these microscopic glass beads, don't make for an impressive presentation in the art space. So I asked if the process of DNA sequencing was actually generating images that I could use in the video. And the images you see are from the 160 cross-sections of the double helix, similar to a CT scan of each of the spinal vertebrae. Lining these images up in the video produces a kind of a flickering animation. It's like a flip book journey through the double helix. Forest mind also refers to the power of thought and imagination in creating realities. I have considered this video anthology an important aspect in my work for decades. In a way, forest mind is a combination of science and metaphysical research. With these works, I'm pleading for greater epistemic diversity in science. I have been thinking what the role of art can be in the shift toward a more ecological paradigm, apart from generally highlighting the role of art in mediating environmental knowledge. Obviously, artistic research should not just add another perspective to science. Rather, it should help to challenge the separation of these different forms of thinking by surprising and interrupting rational thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula, for sharing your very important work and introducing us the concept of pluriversity. Our next speaker sadly could not join us, but they have been very kind to send their presentation in the form of a pre-recorded intervention. They are Kabaje Karanja and Stella Mutegi, founders of K-Bureau, a Nairobi-based multidisciplinary practice charting exploration into architecture and urbanism within nature. They asked us to share with you and to read a few words to introduce their presentation. The Anthropocene Museum 6.0, Freedom Forest, look at the different meaning the forest has been and continues to be from our ancestral past into our generational future. A place of spiritual remembrance and return, a place of linear learning and sustenance, a place of shelter and healing, a place of refuge and resistance, a place for many to thrive as a single harmonious species and life force hive. Enjoy.
I speak the truth. And I swear before God. I swear by the oath of the masses and by the blood of the Kenyan people that I will not let this land go with foreigners, leaving the Kenyan people wretched. If I do so, may this, the people's oath, destroy me, and the blood of the masses turn against me.
I speak the truth and swear before God and before the people present and before the ancestors. I swear by the oath of the masses and by the blood of the Kenyan people. I will never let this land go with foreigners, leaving the people of Kenya wretched. If I do so, may this, the people's oath, destroy me, and the blood of the masses turn against me.
Our forests of spiritual return and remembrance are places of eternal, no linear learning. It is a place where we find our sustenance and lost yearning. Away from the sun, under leafy canopies and caves like Plato, except in return, where we find our hubs of ancestral healing before we return to the celestial plains and streams kneeling.
We were not given freedom. We took it.
These are our forests of refuge where the Mau Mau freedom fighters ran to break the wretched imperial and colonial plan. A place of resistance to imagine an African state of the future with settler teeth bitter and gnashing. It was the betrayal and racist bigotry we fought in the forest geology and far-reaching fallopian phylogeny, for the fighters to thrive as a single life force progeny hive.
I've gone through things. Do you know how old I am? I'm going to 97. So I'm old. They go, they hide, they attack. Unaona ma magazine.
They are home for many, many years.
Yes. Sasa wanakwenda huko, hawana chakula. I'm trying to see if I can see Mudhoni
Now, that
Kerim.
is when the women who were out here used to take food to the near the forest.
Now, I had one woman, I had employed her,
Yeah.
and she was a food smuggler.
Food smuggler.
She's dead now. Her name was Alice. And she was telling me, we could walk from Nyeri by the side of forest, the forest. Wanapita vijiji, navuka ninino. They just carry a barrel taking water from the river. Kwa hivyo hata akishikwa, wanasema mimi natoka ile nyumba pale, hajui huko. Ametoka Nyeri, anaenda karibu na forest, amebeba chakula, anafanya hivi, akiona haoni mtu, anasneak pahali. Wanajua pahali unaweka na wale wanajua kuja kuchukua. Yeye anabeba. Hata watu wa forest wako na maumau. Naambia weka hapa nitaenda. Taenda put a message to them. Meletewa chakula hapo. Na Mudhoni will cook.
She would cook for them.
Yes. I said, these men, you see them, they don't know how to look after themselves. Wakiwa na njaa wanalia, they don't know how to survive. Unless they get a cow, a mbuzi wachinje. They don't know how to survive. I never took oath. But I did more,
Much more than
for Mau Mau than those who took oath. I was a serious letter smuggler.
Let us love it.
No. I'm trying to see if I get a picture of Kirima. Here you are.
Who's this?
That's Kirima.
Kerema.
This is Mudhoni. Marshal. She was a marshal. That's, I knew I had her interview. Here she is. You see?
She looks so serious.
She was a very serious one.
Very serious.
She was organizing men. Wakisikia njaa wanalala, wanalia. Yeah, she was tough. And she would go and steal food from the village. Get it to the fighters.
Listen to the hummingbird that once was, the weaver bird that still is, Wangari Maathai and Muthoni Kerema, lifted up high. You will remember their names and hear what they said behind what they spoke and what they fought for behind what we still fight.
These are the words of Wangari Maathai. The roots of the Mau Mau movement are founded in an old betrayal. In 1890, Captain Frederick Lugard arranged a meeting with Waiyaki Wahinga, a native Kikuyu leader, to establish station posts for the Imperial British East Africa Company on native lands and enable goods to be brought to and from the so-called Lake Victoria. At their meeting, Lugard and Waiyaki swore an oath to allow the station posts on condition that the British would take no native land or property. The agreement, however, did not last long because Lugard's porters started looting the nearby settlements and raping women. The natives fought back in a series of battles that culminated in a standoff in 1892 when Waiyaki was captured and eventually buried alive by the colonial administration. The natives were stunned by Waiyaki's humiliation and death. They learned that the newcomers had no time for verbal promises between themselves and the native population.
From the freedom forests we gained independence, and much of our ancestral land was assimilated. Through a truce of little truths and oaths without trial or sentence, we forgot those who fought for all we could gain. Our children not taught of this great history in great detail, for fear of retribution, and indeed the Queen of England's reparation refrain.
I can envision that stream now, the crystal clear water washing over the pebbles and grain of soil underneath, silky and slow moving. I can see the life in the water and the shrubs, reeds, and fern along the banks, swaying as the current of the water sidles around them. I later learned that there was a connection between the Mugumo fig tree root system and the underground water reservoirs. The roots burrow deep into the ground, breaking through the rocks beneath the surface soil and diving into the underground water table. The water traveled up the roots until it hit a depression or weak place in the ground and gushed out as a spring. Indeed, wherever these Mugumo trees stood, they were likely to be streams. The reverence the community had for the fig tree helped preserve the stream.
We called the installation Obsidian Rain. Through the great canals and piazzas of Venice it came, lifted by laminated lumber from Finland forests of Mezza. Transposed, we exchanged our ancestral cave of resistance beneath Galileo Cini's frescoed dome in space and time changed. So the critics came, despite those who made fun, but alas, our time for healing in reverse established has begun.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you, Kabajo. Now I would like to introduce you our next speaker, another duo that is doing an amazing work close by Berlin. They are Ellen Turner and Pablo Wendel, founders of E-WERK LUCKENWALDE, a power station that is also a contemporary art center. Ellen is a curator and Pablo is an artist, and together they are pioneering an ecological and economic model that produces and supply renewable electricity to the local community and reinvests all the revenue from energy production into its art program. Ellen, Pablo, welcome on stage.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Formafantasma, for the incredible invitation, and to your team who've just been amazing this whole week. So thank you for the wonderful introduction. Yeah, we're from E-WERK LUCKENWALDE, which is this building here, and we're based just 30 minutes south of Berlin. And we are a functioning power station and contemporary art center. And we're the first carbon-negative contemporary art center in the world to be powered by our own means of production. And as Andrea kindly said, we are interested in pioneering alternative economic and ecological models for the cultural sector. But I guess that sounds a little bit abstract unless you know exactly what we're doing. So this idea was really born about 10 years ago when Pablo was working as an artist. And he was sort of exhibiting internationally around the world, being invited to do all these exhibitions. But as is so often the case with contemporary art, he was being paid really, really badly. So much so that he wasn't even able to afford his electricity bill. So he thought, okay, one day, what shall I do? I'm going to start generating my own electricity. I'm going to take hold of my own autonomy. I'm going to start creating my own universe. So he fed electricity back into the grid. And then this idea really spiraled. And he started thinking, wow, this electricity is really this incredible artistic material. It has so much potential. It's sort of the greatest metaphor for art there is, this energy that exists that you can't really hold on to. So he started generating electricity through sculptures, installations, performances, all ecologically through solar, wind, biomass. And then this really spiraled, and he started feeding the electricity into the national grid. He got clients throughout Germany who switched to Kunststrom, which directly translates to art power. And so those clients consisted of museums, institutions, galleries, private offices, studios, private people. And all of their electricity bill was then financing him as an artist. So all of a sudden, he had kind of created his own autonomy. He wasn't reliant on the art market. He wasn't reliant on philanthropic models. He was sort of reliant on the sale of his electricity. And then his client database was growing and growing and growing. And then he had this wild idea to find a power station of the fossil fuel era and transform it into a Kunststrom Kraftwerk. And so we were led to Luckenwalde. And Pablo discovered this incredible power station dating back to 1913, which was a former brown coal power station. And as you can see, this is the entrance to the building. So it was really built in order to kind of herald the mysticism and potential of electricity. It was built in 1913, so that was sort of 30, 40 years after the discovery of an industrialization of electricity. So the building is really painted in order to convince people of electricity's power. So it really has this kind of mysticism to it. And this is the turbine hall. Oh, sorry. That we have. This is the kind of heart of the building, and this is 360 meters square. And when we took on the building, we knew we wanted to reactivate it. We knew we wanted to generate electricity again, but not with brown coal, obviously, ecologically, with Kunststrom. But we also wanted it to be this kind of contemporary art environment. So we decided to separate it into levels. And so on the bottom of E-WERK, there is production. So we have a wood workshop, we have a metal workshop, we have an engineering workshop. The ground floor is the Contemporary Art Center. So we have 3 galleries and the turbine hall. And then the top floor, the 3rd floor, are all artist studios subsidized. And then, so we decided we had this kind of formula and framework for the institution, but now we had to actually turn the institution back on. We had to start generating electricity again. So Pablo labored for 2 years to try and get this kind of dinosaur of machinery to work again. It had laid dormant for 30 years. It was active as a brown coal power station until 1989, and then when the wall fell in Berlin, it was defunct. So it was this incredible challenge to sort of lug this dinosaur of a machinery back into life again. And this is Pablo in the cogs of the building. So this is in the very altars above the engine room, which is the space he did actually manage to reactivate.
Yeah, hello everyone. Yeah, talking about energy and as an artist working with energy, I think over it's now 10 years time, it really changes your perspective. Like coming in this room, of course you see the beauty of it, you see the forest, you see the history as we heard, but you also see the energy in it. Like basically building a building, like here, it's not just the wood you need to take out of the forest, it's the stones you need to heat up, you need energy, and it's everywhere is full of energy. So producing energy is the one thing, but also thinking of how do you save energy is the other thing. Here we talk about a brown coal station, so it has a bad history in a way, but also a very important history because it's our past, it's our history. And seeing this building as an artist and thinking of how could we use this building into something, transform it into something which is culture, but also which reflects the history, but also which uses it. So knocking it down, you would destroy all this energy which is in the building, but also turning it on with brown coal, it's not the right time anymore. And so I was really impressed with the building and started to study and try to understand how it used to work, which is very complex. The more you get in, the more answers you get, the more questions you actually have. And seeing this details of the engineering, of the development over the centuries, we had to get in contact with a lot of people who used to work there. So the former brown coal people, like here you can see Herr Schmiedl on the right-hand side, he used to work his whole life, actually his whole family used to work there. And with him, with his information, how a power station is working, and also with the idea to start to turn the power station on again, but not with coal, to use it CO2 neutral, in this case with wood. So we are on the other hand of the forest, we're using the wood as as our energy, as the beginning of providing the power for the sustainability of the institution. So we use a pyrolysis system, which is a wood gas system, and in order to use this, we basically had to turn on the power station to use, like we basically used the conveyor belts, the infrastructure, everything had to be turned on. But we not burn the wood, that would be very bad. We basically make a pyrolysis process where we produce the wood gas. And this wood gas gets filtered and it gets cooled down, and then it goes into a car or truck engine and it gets burned again and it produces movement. Basically, it turns on a generator which produces electricity, and on the other hand, there's a lot of heat, waste heat. And this is very important, to not burn it and just have the heat, to use it like very efficient in a way. And through this, we are able to heat the whole house, the whole exhibition place, but we also can provide energy, electricity for the whole exhibitions, for the place, for the workshops, for the art production, also for the transport, for the mobility of it. And here you can see a very nice example of an art piece which is produced by Nicolas Desché. He produced radiators and they've been exhibited in the gallery rooms, and the waste heat I was just mentioning went through the sculptures and heated up the gallery room. So this is a listed building. It was very tricky to think of a way how to make it CO2 neutral, and I think using the wood was a way to make it CO2 neutral because it binds the wood when it grows, and it's very important to close the circle. So after this process we have a charcoal left over, and we try to bring this charcoal back into the forest, which is not allowed legally, but we still produce it for our own garden with a terra preta. And I think it's very important to think of wood not just as something, as pure energy and something you take, and I think it's a circle. You have to bring it back, and you also have to think of the way, where's the wood from and what kind of wood do you use? Like the furnitures or all the wood we use these days, often it just ends up on a skip or even combined with some material which is really bad for the environment, so it's garbage. And if you think it in a circle, then I think it can go back into the nature, and it's also a question, how do you treat and how do you grow a forest? And so we started to work with the people who do the agra or the forest culture and try to, with them together, to reforest the area which is in a really bad state because it's been just monoculture over many, many years. So it's maybe a solution not for everyone. I don't want to pray for the pyrolysis system to change the whole world into using wood. We would have no forest. That's not a solution. I think there's wind and solar and other technologies are great, especially when you combine it with the design and with the creativity, with art. I think then, you can also, it allows us to take the people on board, because in a minute what we need is very urgent people who understand the way how we live, that we have to change it. And I think we were very sick of talking about it, and that was the point at E-WERK LUCKENWALDE. We basically started to change it. And I mean, it's not perfect and it's a lot to do, but I think it's very important to find a moment where you just start and you have to just do it. And in this case, we manage it. We are not just CO2 neutral, we even plus, because we use the charcoal afterwards, but we also use this for the energy and for the transport and even for the food, the growing of the food, the aquaculture. So I think, thinking of energy is something, it goes beyond the electricity coming out of socket. It's something more. And in these days, we're very happy that we are able to run a cultural institution, totally independent and autonomously from a lot of, from fossil energy, but also from a lot of certain fundings. And I think I would like to give the word to Helen, and she talks a little bit more about the content, which is very important for the E-WERK.
Yeah, so I guess we'd switched the power station back on. We were now a functioning power station, but now we had to bring the art back into the building, I guess. And I was very aware of my position as a foreigner in the middle of Brandenburg, and very conscious not to create kind of a contemporary art satellite in the middle of Brandenburg, which wouldn't engage the local community. They would feel alienated. It would kind of give contemporary art an even worse reputation than it already has. Particularly with the kind of interdisciplinary nature of E-WERK and the fact that we're working with energy and electricity and the historic buildings, etc. So I really wanted the program to be ambitious and extremely international, but not reductive and accessible. Challenge of my career, I guess. But this example of Nicolas Dechet's radiators was quite successful, because as soon as Pablo switched the power station on at our grand opening in 2019, people would actually come in the room and they would feel the heat and they would understand that the building was switched on again. So this was the first piece. And then alongside this, we also built this 18-meter diameter geodesic dome by architectural collective Umschichten to house the Contemporary Art Institution's public programs. So we've housed gigs and lectures and workshops in here. And it was really important for us that the building would continue to be sustainable and continue to house all the kind of programming that we wanted it to house. And then we also built Trafo, which is our low-carbon kitchen. So again, like every asset of E-WERK, we really wanted to breathe in this idea of ecology. And how can we do things differently? And how can we challenge kind of the systems that already exist? And then also Superkunststrom, which is our Tankstelle, tank station outside E-WERK, where anybody can come and charge their e-bike or e-car for free with Kunststrom electricity. So we often have a few Teslas rocking up outside E-WERK, which is quite funny. And then we also launched Power Night in 2019, which is our performance program. And I invite every 2 years an international guest curator to curate a contemporary art program and invite artists to take over all the abandoned spaces throughout Luckenwalde. So hopefully this will play and give you an impression.
Hope is not enough.
So that was Power Night 2019, and then of course, as we all know, the pandemic hit, and we just opened, so of course it was a really crucial moment to test our kind of resilience and whether we could survive as an institution. And I'm glad to say that we did, and I think it really pays tribute to this kind of autonomous model we were trying to create. We didn't have the funding for the program, but we had the funding to survive, to stay afloat through the sale of electricity, which I guess people still needed being in their homes all the time. So this was kind of a good testing moment. And then in 2021, we invited Lucia Piccioschi, who was the General Ecology Curator at Serpentine Galleries in London. And she was also the curator of Sun and Sea Marina, which won the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale in 2019. And I had known this work from the Venice Biennale, and I had known how it brought people to tears, literally to tears, leaving the venue, because they were just suddenly confronted by their own complicity in the climate emergency. And I just thought it would just be incredible to bring this piece to Luckenwalde to audiences who hadn't had the opportunity to see it in Venice. And also, I must say, in Luckenwalde, we have a very high population of AfD voters who don't believe there's a climate emergency. So you see a lot around town, sort of "fuck you, Greta" written on the back of bumpers. So, you know, there's definitely antagonism towards what we were doing. And I thought, let's present this program, let's offer it for free, let's see if we can move people. So we brought Sun and Sea to the building that is adjacent to E-WERK, the Bauhaus Stadtbad, and it was a really incredible moment. And then we were also thinking, how can we curate differently? How can we curate sustainably? How can we maybe slow down on a planetary but also human scale? I mean, I think pre-pandemic, talking for myself, but I was very close to burnout. I know a lot of people in the contemporary art world are often very close to burnout. We have this kind of excessive level pace that we feel like we have to adhere to. And as an independent institution, there is no reason why we shouldn't sort of rethink that model and think how we can do things differently, how we can perhaps slow down, do things better. Also, on a sustainable level, if you have a slower program, a longer program, if you have longer lead times, you can actually buy things that are more sustainable or do it much more sustainably. So we decided to divide the whole Power Nights program into chapters that would unveil over the course of a year. And so in October, we then unveiled Static Range by Himali Singh Swan in our Gallery 1, alongside The Family, a Zombie Movie by Caribbean Film Collective, who are actually a group of non-artists. They're indigenous Australian people who use filmmaking as a way to reclaim their territory. So the whole of this program, curated by Lucia Piccioschi in collaboration with Katerina Worf, Adriana Tranca, and myself, was really thinking about fertility in kind of different ways, and how the side name is called Being Mothers. So how can we take care of the earth? And then in March, we unveiled Three Hearts by Revital Cohen and Turvan Ballan. And then in April, we then unveiled Womb Wisdom by Tabata Reza in our Flux Dome, which Tabata invited 3 women from French Guyana to speak about their practice as a Hebama. So it's kind of these different indigenous potentially lost knowledges that are also being interwoven into this program. And then we also unveiled Grundbrot by Cooking Sections in our low carbon kitchen, and this was a biodynamic recipe in collaboration with Guttenbüssel, a farm in Brandenburg. So this was, again, Cooking Sections trying to integrate the local community, but also creating a legacy program that would now be sold in Trafo for perpetuity. And then finally, Sissel Tolas, who's sitting on ours, wonderful Sissel, is also working with us, and Sissel and Isabel Lewis are doing a train intervention from Berlin to Luckenwalde, and it will be composed of smell, choreography, and sound. And this was the first intervention that took place about a month ago. And this is 2 performers wearing wigs that are infused with the idiosyncratic smell of wood chips that permeates E-WERK, that Sissel so wonderfully diffused into a smell and infused in these wigs. So this is kind of a snapshot of what we are doing and what we're trying to sort of speak about. But it would be wonderful if you all come to our next events. We've got an event actually this Saturday, if you happen to be in Berlin. And if not, we've got another event on 30th of July where Sissel's work will culminate in actually the hat factory that is round the corner from E-WERK, which is an incredible Eric Mendelsohn building. So I think just the final note would be to say, this is kind of why we do the work, I guess. And it's the most exciting thing for us is being kind of on the periphery of the city and being able to kind of play with the impossible and sort of try out different methods that probably are not possible in kind of urban settings. Thank you.
Alan, Pablo, thank you so much. It was a fantastic presentation, and really congratulations for what you are doing. I really hope the majority of institutions will follow your path. It's an amazing work what you are doing. Really, thank you so much. Really, really thank you. So now we go into the very last panel of the symposium, and we are extremely honored and happy to welcome on stage ARIC CHEN and FEIFEI ZHOU, while we also welcome ANNA TSING, who is joining the conversation remotely. ANNA FEIFEI join us both as representative of the Feral Atlas, which is a fantastic digital platform and a compendium of narratives and knowledge that looks at entanglements between the man-made and the realities of modern humans. ARIC, I'm going to let you do a proper introduction about, of course, you, FEIFEI, and Anna. Thank you.
I think FEIFEI, if you sit over there. Okay. Great, thank you, Andrea, for that introduction, and really thank you to Simone and Andrea, together with Prada, for having all of us here these past 3 days. It's been an incredible series of talks and lectures, and it's really, and presentations, and it's really an honor and privilege for me to be able to help close it off with these two incredible people. I'll briefly introduce Anna Tsing, who probably needs no introduction for many of you. Anna is an anthropologist and professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, as well as Aarhus University in Denmark, from where she's joining us today, I believe, Anna. Anna, amongst many other things, is the author of The Mushroom at the End of the World, which has become such an incredible reference point for many of the sorts of more than human discourses that we've been hearing today and over the past 3 days. She was also the co-editor of the Feral Atlas, the More Than Human Anthropocene, together with FEIFEI, who is here, who we're really happy to have here in Milan today. FEIFEI is a visual and spatial designer. Similar to Feral Atlas, I think, kind of looking at the entanglements between more than human and natural ecologies and human infrastructures through various multidisciplinary approaches. FEIFEI was, as I think I just said, co-editor as well of the Feral Atlas, and is a teacher of architecture at both BA and MA at Central St. Martin's. So we are going to have FEIFEI and Anna tell us a little bit about their latest work, which is an evolution of some of the ideas that they began looking at with Feral Atlas. We will have some time at the end for questions, so please start logging those mentally. So, FEIFEI, please, and Anna.
I guess I'll represent Anna and I and thank the Formafantasma team and Prada team, and thank ARIC for the introduction. And we're happy to be here to talk about the ghost shapes in the forest. Designers follow form. From crafting objects to space, we constantly push the boundaries of material possibilities, shaping or transforming new modes of spatial experiences. Forms can be expressive, symbolic, political, or however we, as designers, choose to design or challenge it. And as visual people, we are most familiar with forms. Forms are an important thread to follow in ways we understand the built environment. But if we want to learn about forest, we need to learn about its form too. The forms of forest are complex, entangled, and not so easy to observe through naked eyes. And in this presentation, we would like to encourage you that when thinking of form, think beyond objects, and think in the form of the forest. Think like a forest.
Perhaps it's worth saying that we wrote this presentation for you because of the theme of the forest and because of the name Formafantasma. The form is the message. Too often, people want to hold a conversation with plants. This is because language is our easiest way to communicate. But what if we paid attention to modalities of attention that we share with plants instead? I'm thinking about form. Form, understood broadly, tells the story of a plant's history. Next slide, please. A tree's branches grow out horizontally into the light. In the shade, they reach upward. This is a life history through form. If we imagine human form not through the shape of our bodies, but rather through the shape of our movements over time, this form in motion is also our life history. We learned to appreciate this during the coronavirus quarantine when we could not shape our motions as we might have liked. We moved from the bed to the kitchen and whatever living space we had. Our form in motion was limited. Next slide. Imagine a line following you around through all your movements, sedimenting into more and more scribbles over time. That line tracks your life story. Form is shared by humans and plants as a communication about our lives. Forests tell their stories through form. I've already mentioned the form of branches, but equally important is the form of roots. In my work on fungi, I've studied root connections between trees and the fungi that wrap themselves around roots, called ectomycorrhizal fungi. Ectomycorrhizal fungi make forests possible. In temperate and boreal forests, as well as Old World tropical forests, the trees that are successful in making forests have ectomycorrhizal companions. Their alliance with fungi makes them strong enough to not just build trees, but also forests. We depend on forest resurgence, that is, the ability of forests to grow back, even if we cut them down. Resurgence depends on the root-fungi connection, which brings a forest back. It's a good reason to learn to appreciate the form of roots and fungi embracing each other. Next slide. Different species of trees have different characteristic root shapes, and when they get together with fungi, different forms result depending on the species of fungus. Underground form is central to the resilience of the forest. Interspecies form matters for humans as well as forests. Remembering that keeps us from objectifying forests as mere resources. We share the making of form with our plant and fungal associates. Consider the fact that we depend on bacteria to digest our food. Our human cells cannot digest food. Only our bacterial companions do that work for us. To make them happy to do this work, we build tree-like intestinal villi for the bacteria. Like leaves on a tree, the bacteria produce energy components for us from their food. Next slide. Indeed, the form of intestinal villi reminds me a lot of the form of a forest. Both are multi-species alliances through form. For the forest, the ectomycorrhizal fungi remain underground with the roots, while the trees build great structures of energy production to support their fungal companions. Inside us, we build the vertical structures so that bacteria can produce the energy for us. Hold on to the convergence of forms. If refusing the possibility of interspecies forms kills off forests, it might also kill us off too. One of the characteristics of this time we call the Anthropocene is the human ability to stop forest resurgence. It's one thing to cut down a forest, which can be a step within its renewal. It's another thing to stop it from growing back. And it's this latter, this kind of double death, to use Deborah Bird Rose's term, that characterizes environmental catastrophe. One way we've made this happen, surprisingly, is through the planting of forest substitutes, that is, tree plantations. It turns out that rows and rows of monocrop trees don't work in the same way as a forest at all. We might understand this as a change in form. The form of the plantation encourages pests and pathogens. As pests and pathogens travel around the globe following anthropogenic shipping channels, they destroy forests in a way that felling cannot accomplish. They stop forest regeneration. Pests and pathogens care about form. The heterogeneous forest is not a good form for the spread of pests and pathogens, but the tree plantation is excellent. Plantations encourage the gathering and rapid evolution of pathogens, fostering new kinds of virulence. Do recall that this is form. We are talking about humans too. Let's start with Heterobasidian root rot, the most dangerous pathogen of commercial conifer plantations. Heterobasidian is a fungus, but not an ectomycorrhizal one. Next slide. Instead, Heterobasidian eats both dead wood and the living wood that it kills. Heterobasidian kills trees. In a natural forest, Heterobasidian might kill one tree, but then it would be stopped by a gap. In contrast, let's consider how Heterobasidian travels in a conifer plantation. Recall that the trees are genetically similar. Go back to the last slide for a minute, please. The trees are genetically similar and closely spaced. That means that the fungus can travel in the natural root grafts underground that connect all these trees. Once it's infected one tree, it will get to them all. The patch structure of the forest is missing here. Instead, the form of the plantation encourages fungal infection. Furthermore, the plantation is likely to include some stumps, perfect places for new Heterobasidian spores to germinate. The infection travels from the stumps to nearby trees and then their root grafts. This killer fungus takes advantage of the plantation form to kill trees. Worse yet, once plantations are infected, the infections can spread to actual forests. As long as we confuse tree plantations and forests, forests are vulnerable to the pathogens encouraged by plantation form. In introducing Feral Atlas in our next section, Faye will explain why.
Form across scales. Form matters in different scales. For example, what can we learn from observing forms from a landscape? Here you're looking at the forms of 3 small areas of potato fields in the Andes, showing a rich diversity in potato species, with each plant represented by a different icon. And the key here on the left indicates names given by the local farmers based on the traits of their tubers. There are over 4,500 varieties of native potato, mostly found in the Andes. And in fact, the varietal diversity of a single Andean potato field exceeds the diversity of 9/10 of the entire potato crop of the United States. Compare this image with the following slide that shows a similar sized potato field in the US, where a single potato field will exceed 100 acres. The Russet Bourbon variety, represented here in circles, accounts for 40.9% of the total national acreage in the US. This is a diagram created by Feral Atlas map director Lily Carr, explaining the form of monoculture potato field enable potato blight to completely take over. To think about ways to observe and represent forms across scales, we want to introduce you Feral Atlas. In 2020, more than 100 scientists, humanists, and artists came together, and we published Feral Atlas, the Modern Human Anthropocene, a digital atlas that combines field-based observations, scientific analysis, and artistic representations to offer a wide array of genres and methods to notice, comprehend, and analyze the Anthropocene. We assembled 79 empirically made field reports from contributors from diverse disciplinary backgrounds to show various cases of feral ecologies. That is, the ecologies that have been encouraged by human-built infrastructures, which have developed and spread beyond human control. Each floating watercolor critter represents a feral entity. Here is a series of 4 large-scale drawings we presented in Feral Atlas that shows the historical conjunctures that give rise to powerful and dangerous infrastructure building programs, each titled Invasion, Empire, Capital, and Acceleration. There is no single coherent perspective or viewpoint in which these landscapes were created. Capital, for instance, is created as isometric drawing, and its goal is clear: the skewed projection of the holistic landscape, to appear homogeneous is similar to what capitalists were doing, homogenizing the landscape to maximize the efficiency of commodifying natural resources. See various plantations, such as cotton farms next to the banana plantation being spread with pesticides. Orange trees right next to the sugarcane plantation. Moving on to the industrial nurseries next to factories and skyscrapers. Below that, you see the abandoned English factories during the Industrial Revolution, next to the meat processing plants, next to the warehouse workers and supermarket shelves, next to the shipping containers, and here lies the burning nuclear power plant, where people are desperately trying to salvage. The seemingly orderly system is also breaking down. So how can the form of a forest communicate what it's been through with us? Follow this gray dot on capital landscape. You will explore the field report by environmental scientist Yvette Perfecto on commercial coffee plantation. And here, let's pay attention to the elevational diagram of how forms of a forest change due to the intensified coffee technification. From the top, we can see a traditional method of coffee plantation in conjunction with shade trees that form a diverse and heterogeneous canopy known as rustic coffee. And as it moves downwards, the tree species are reduced as coffee plantation intensifies, resulting in a decreased biodiversity showing as traditional polyculture and commercial polyculture. And here's showing a shaded monoculture, the shaded trees are homogenized into a single species, and finally, only coffee plantation left, as shown here as unshaded monoculture. The coffee rust fungus quickly took the advantage of the monoculture form, single species, densely packed, and neatly ranged. The wind-borne spores spread much faster than it normally would, causing disease outbreaks and major devastations. Something that's so mundane can be the cause of ecological disasters without us noticing too. Wood pallets that facilitate the vast demand of global shipping industry. Turns out that while carrying goods across the globe, it transports unwanted hitchhikers too, such as Asian langhorn beetles and emerald ash borer, which are dangerous pests that devastate forests wherever they land. This diagram is not only the form of shipping movements, but also the form of movement of pests. By not looking carefully enough and neglecting the form of other non-human entities that weren't being considered important in the first place, feral ecologies emerge into an environmental catastrophe that's unexpected and uncontrollable. If we just look close enough, we might just notice our most familiar cities, such as London and Milan, and other port cities on the edge of these densely clustered lines. The globe has now become a single form. Understanding form through merely locations and territorial boundaries prevent us from understanding the emergence and spreading of these undesigned effects, such as this diagram, showing here that aims to show the accumulation of introduced forest pests to the continental United States. Each color here represents a type of forest, and a number indicates how many known non-indigenous pests and pathogens were found. Bound by continents and country borders, this map shows where the pests and pathogens end up, but not where they came from, nor where they've been through. It doesn't show the transnational, sometimes back and forth movements of forest pests. The boundary here becomes unhelpful as we pay attention to the wrong form. It's critical for us to understand forms across scales in order to understand feral processes. The phantasmic in the forest. Feral ecologies are what escapes the master plans by designers, engineers, and developers. Some are always there, but because we didn't care for it, we chose not to see it. This diagram might be familiar to many of us. This is a form of our drinking water being filtered from ground or surface water through several stages. But Peter Funk from Fair Atlas showed us how this is also the form of some microscopic animals named male fauna, who survived chemical treatments like chlorination and being drunk by humans every day. Just look at this semi-cute, somehow slightly scary-looking creature. This is an unidentified freshwater Deloid rotifer. Not enough research is done to identify the exact impact after entering humans' body. But these phantasmic animals, after being swallowed every time you take a sip of your water, some of us in the audience might actually have a good view of them swimming in your stomach right now. The phantasm are all around us, but it's hard to track down. Its effects are more than human, and not only ecological, but also social. In Gabriel Heck's entry on acid mine drainage in Fair Atlas, humans, as well as mine sites, are seen as residual by the government. While extracting commercially valuable elements from the rocks, the leftovers become useless residues. The accumulation of these mine dumps are at a scale that has changed geographical and social landscapes. In this picture on the left, you can see the informal settlements in the foreground and the mine dumps in the background. Its remain toxicity is in the air we breathe, the water we drink, the earth we touch and plant our seeds in. The phantasmic forms spread unevenly, and it reveals social inequality.
If we want to appreciate feral ecologies, the unwanted ghosts of development and design, we might look at form. The phantasm of feral ecologies is revealed through form. Formafantasma. Form can show the traces of feral ecologies. The phantasm is in the form. Look at this stump of a chestnut tree photographed by anthropologist Andrew Matthews in his study of forest histories in northern Italy. In this area, chestnuts were once a major source of livelihood in the countryside. In the so-called modernization of tree planting, in which plantations and forests were confused, new breeds of chestnut were introduced from commercial and government nurseries. The new trees were introduced together with killer diseases picked up in the plantation-like nurseries. Chestnuts died, destroying rural livelihoods. Here's what Matthews writes about the form of this stump. By counting the number of stems on the stumps of ancient chestnut trees, I can estimate the timing of successive firewood cutting, which has produced the smaller stumps on this ancient stem. The panicked cutting in the face of chestnut canker in the 1950s led to the liquidation of this ancient chestnut tree in the nearby tannin factory at Bagni de Lucca. The smaller stumps record the effects of two subsequent firewood cuts. This stump is likely linked to the tree nurseries where hopeful scientists tried to overcome Phytophthora, that's one chestnut disease, by planting disease-resistant Japanese chestnut in the 1920s, unintentionally spreading Cryphonectra, another chestnut disease, to these chestnut groves. That's the end of the quote. The form of the stump reveals the traces of feral ecologies that created ruins here, the ghosts of rural livelihoods. Form is sometimes the ghostly killer itself. Consider the grasses introduced into Latin America as good pasturage for the cattle loved by settlers. Rosa Fisek writes for Feral Atlas about the transformation of the landscape from tropical forest to pasture through these grasses. The grasses were indeed introduced, but they moved far beyond the designs of their introducers. The hardy pasture grasses introduced for cattle have dense and powerful root systems. Some have deep and plentiful roots. Others have rhizomes, that is, spreading roots that grow from stems across the ground. Next slide. These roots form dense networks across the top of the soil. Together, the forms of grass roots block the regeneration of the forest. Tree seedlings cannot find a hold among the dense roots of these grasses. The forest cannot regenerate. It retreats. The forest is the livelihood of the indigenous people as well as Afro-descendants. The retreat of the forest is also the dispossession of these human communities. Even settlers suffer from this form. When they try to plant crops, their plantings are overrun by the unstoppable form of the pasture grass roots, which block out other plants. The form itself is the conqueror. Forests are defeated by the form of grassroots.
Let's take a moment to think of the form of the forest again. Think through patches, scales, movements. Think above ground and underground. Think like a forest, not plantation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna and FEIFEI, for that. There's really a lot to talk about. And I guess maybe we can, let's build on this idea of form a little bit, because I understand that this is sort of a new-ish concept for you that you're sort of introducing today. And so it's a real treat for all of us to be kind of, in on this. FEIFEI, you had described this notion of form to me earlier as an accumulation of history, right? And especially if we talk about it in terms of landscape, or even landscape in the literal sense, which I guess would fit really well into this notion of the Anthropocene that you've been exploring too, right? Because at least I think technically the Anthropocene as a term comes out of the categorization of Earth's geological layers through sedimentary buildup and so on and so forth. So, like, I mean, but obviously you're not looking at form and landscape from a kind of Cartesian point of view, right? I mean, you're sort of trying to go beyond the sort of Cartesian cartographies that are so implicitly tied in with colonialism and extractive practices and so on and so forth. So, I mean, what other models can we use to think of form as landscape? I mean, what other sorts of cartographies or cartographic conceptual tools, since we're in a crowd of designers here, might we think about?
I think when you're thinking of the Cartesian representation of form, it's the kind of drone's eye view from above, or what Donna Haraway's called the God's eye view. The form that we're thinking of is a sedimentation, a growth, a building of life experiences, including movement or growth, flourishing, the ways that organisms become themselves. So it starts from the life of the organisms rather than being imposed from above. And so all that stuff that Faye just wonderfully said about the smell and the dampness and the need to attune your body to form, to really appreciate form, you need to get down and dirty with the lifeways of the kinds of organisms that you're interested in. That represents form as an understanding of what organisms are doing rather than just how they look to some outside observer.
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of clever of you guys to be talking about form, at Milan Design Week in a room full of people who are, if not designers, certainly in the design world. Because, as we all know, we as a discipline have been spending decades trying to shake, that mantra of like form and function and the sort of fetishization of physical object form that much of design as it's been constructed. Since the 20th century, at least, is based on. I mean, this is obviously on purpose, right? And so I'm wondering, Anna, based on what you just said, how can we sort of redefine what we mean by form? I mean, you're saying that form now takes a sort of non-human agency. But FEIFEI also earlier said that we can think of form as communication. So I mean, is what is this new construct of form that we should be thinking about?
Well, there's two kinds of ways that I'm thinking about form in relation to livability. And one is the form of organisms themselves. So just like you said, non-human agency and the ways that organisms tell their stories, as you would, is through form, I'm arguing. So that's the communication part that FEIFEI's talking about, that organisms, what we want to see about the kind of space they're taking up in the world and what they are doing, that's a new definition of form. The second kind of form that seems equally relevant is the kind of environmental affordances for non-humans, which also involves form. That we talked about how those plant pathogens are going through the form of the plantation. So from the pathogen's point of view, the form of the plantation is an affordance through which, heterobasidion goes through the roots of the plantation trees because they're so genetically similar and planted so close together. So that's a second meaning of form that seems to me equally important. And FEIFEI and I are trying to start a new project where we're seeing coastlines as a set of affordances for living things, including humans, that we need to understand in relation, for example, to how porous the coastline is, that thinking of the tropics, a mangrove swamp is full of mud and water and plant roots, and that's why it's such a good place for fish and shrimp and crabs, and it becomes the nursery of the whole ocean. And yet it also can be the place where kinds of heavy metals, pollutions, and other anthropogenic kinds of ways that porosity gets repurposed. So that meaning of form has to do with the structures through which life can be enacted.
I think in relation to the Milan Design Week too, we started our presentation by saying, think not like object, think not in the form of an object. That really kind of come into my mind, the form of a chair that has appeared, everywhere. And I think the topic of form to me also has this kind of living aspect to it. Because the chair kind of, by defining its very specific form, it kind of stopped the wood to be able to kind of go on. Whereas the roots, the form of a root and the mycelium has this tendency to actually continue even after the moment we start to observe it. Whereas, if the chair gets a bit of a fungal, infection or get a bit damp, what you want to do is actually get rid of it. You kind of tend to not allowing the continuation of the living form. So I think that's, like you said, this kind of obsession with tidiness and cleanliness from designers, even landscape designers, of thinking, is the role of trees kind of lined up in a very neat manner? And if there's kind of a bit of a weed growing, the first reaction is actually get rid of it. Whereas I think it's because ignoring the form that's underground, which is just messy, that's kind of nature's natural form is messiness. We tend to kind of ignore that actually, I was reading Silent Spring by Rachel Carson recently about, some weed actually just makes soil more fertile. And by getting rid of the weed, not even understanding what the role of the weed, we kill the fertility of the soil. So I think that's also the kind of alive, living aspect of the form that, we're interested in.
Yep. I mean, this is all a little bit abstract, probably. I'm sure there must be questions from the audience. But, well, while you build up your courage, maybe I will ask another question then. Well, okay, so I mean, to go back to sort of, talking about this and framing all of this with, in a design context, I mean, Anna, you know, you're an anthropologist, right? And I know, FEIFEI, you studied, you come from a design and architecture background. I think it'd be interesting to sort of hear how you both kind of wound up working together, and also Anna, you know, why would someone from anthropology sort of, you know, choose to work with a designer? What tools or what roles can design play in bringing these ideas out? Or forming these ideas, even, I should say.
I can briefly just speak about architects been following anthropologists' work for a very long time. And I think it's about the built environment, right? And then we cannot not studying about humans. And then when we start to study humans, we cannot not study about the non-humans. So I think that's a very kind of simple, brief answer of why we started this collaboration, and then see more architects and designers start to collaborate with social scientists. And then I'll give it to Anna about, yeah.
Well, one thing I wanted to hark back to the last conversation before really starting this about the chairs. And I was thinking about a photograph of a chair that was in one of the mushroom identification books I studied. And a chair had gotten rather damp. And so you can see a row of oyster mushrooms growing from the bottom of the chair. And to me, that's a part of what this ghost forms that we're looking at is, you know, as long as you think of the chair as only something that people sit in, having mushrooms growing from your chair is a really terrible thing. But if you start looking at these ghost forms that we've been trying to point to today, those mushrooms growing from the bottom of the chair are, in fact, part of the story of what's going on in the world that we should be paying attention to. But let me turn to the why should anthropologists and designers and artists and architects start working together? Because for me, it's been a fantastic privilege to have the chance to work with Faye and to watch how she can use a kind of spatial and visual analysis to open up the questions that social scientists, humanists, and natural scientists are working on, that through the skills of bringing visual conventions of various sorts into these projects, things become clear that were not at all clear before. The reason I'm so excited about working with Faye on this coastal ecologies project and coastal livelihoods is because I think if Faye can start to show us new aspects through the kind of analysis that she knows how to do, that the anthropologists and social scientists involved in the project are just going to burst with new questions and new ideas that we can only see from the visual analysis that she's offering us.
Yeah, because it seems like a lot of the discussions, both today and throughout this week and in the broader sort of conversation, you know, it seems to some degree we're moving beyond talking about the observable towards sort of trying to grasp the less observable or unobservable or unseen. Right, and when we think about design as a form of, let's say, visualization or articulation, or one could argue that is maybe one role that design plays, is that it makes the invisible or less visible. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's almost like translation, right?
Yeah.
Rather than language as a visual form, which is somehow easier maybe even than the spoken language to communicate. So it gives us, you know, as kind of visual designers, a burden too of how to translate. You know, sometimes I work with Anna and work with social scientists who give such kind of brilliant compilation of these empirical-based studies, and there is the responsibility to do justice, to translate in a kind of visually stimulating way, but at the same time not to kind of disrespect it by making it a purely visual object or art representation.
Okay, so then, but then, what do we do with that, right? And maybe this is unfair because you're, you know, you know, you're focusing still, I think, on the research. But we used to talk about design, you know, very confidently as a problem-solving exercise. You know, we were going to solve problems. We don't do that as much anymore. I think, thankfully, because we're well aware now that the bigger problems, at least, are much too complex to be solved. And in fact, they have all sorts of unintended consequences and knock-on effects, and one person or one being's solution is another being's problem, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not so black and white. So then through these visualizations then, you know, as designers, you know, can we sort of form a kind of means of negotiating, let's say, these very complex and thorny issues with their complex and thorny interactions of agencies. And then in following, if we're talking about form now, form as these, you know, sort of these entanglements and intertwinements between different systems and cosmologies and ecologies, you know, and multi-species points of view and so on and so forth. If their entanglement with, you know, the human sort of infrastructure, as you focused on with Feral Atlas, is sort of the problem, so to speak, then do we also need to start talking about ways of disentanglement and unforming or deforming? It's a long question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm trying to digest it in my head. I think I'll briefly speak about it and then give the mic to Anna. To me, there's a general misunderstanding in perhaps the field of architecture or other disciplines too, that environmental crisis is an urgent problem, so the solution needs to be urgently made. Which is why form is such an important threat to consider, because form talks about accumulation, there's a history and there's a development. So these urgent environmental problems doesn't just happen within days. It's accumulation of decades, of centuries, of constant evolving of ecology, of social movements, of all the other aspects. So when we try to become the problem solver, we cannot just kind of confront the very surface level issue anymore. That's why it requires actually for us to take a very long time to research, to understand. So by kind of, to me, think of form is not just how we observe, it's actually what we observe. Mm-hmm. So I feel like, again, talking about above ground and underground is, if we just kind of looking at a landscape from the above ground level and the thinking, you know, the resolving the problem is happening on a very surface level, it doesn't quite resolve the issue anyway. So I think these kind of visualizations is a kind of fundamental or first entry of perhaps where the intervention happens is not really the very obvious level, is somewhere else. Or perhaps sometimes the intervention is not to intervene. And you know, there's a long way to go for me, for us, and for a lot of other people to really work out how these visual narratives can become a design, or part of the design at least. But I do believe that starts this design process to kind of introduce a new type of perspective, or another way of thinking about what the role of design is.
Anna, we're all looking at you.
Okay, I've got two things that maybe add, and one is the importance of the ghost form that we were talking about. And that's one piece of what's wrong with business as usual in design. And again, to say the problem is just looking at the chair rather than the mushrooms that happen to be growing from the base of the chair once it gets damp. That it's these ghost forms, that is the form of the forest that we've mentioned that cannot be, so the plantation is like design business as usual, not paying attention to ghost forms, not paying attention to the things that have been easy to ignore until recently. So it's really important for designers to break out of the kind of business as usual design in which they're just trying to meet a problem, and they do it without thinking of what the ghost forms that they are bringing into being with the practical forms that they're coming up with. And that brings me to my second kind of intervention. I mean, I think what's exciting about the design field now is the extent to which it has gone into conceptual issues, that the traditional design that you were mentioning before starts us off with, we'll accept everything that's the kind of hegemonic policy, you know, materials have to be a certain kind of way because we'll accept the market and we'll accept the rule of rich people and we'll accept, you know, the privatization of everything, that those are just random examples of business as usual. But that design also can have a big role to play in unsettling business as usual concepts. And that's where I'm so excited to work with designers, including FEIFEI, is that the diagrams and sketches that she has done open up ways of thinking about social relations that aren't clear, and that it brings you to new conceptual kinds of material. That what she showed you, for example, of these historical conjunctures and how capitalism might work, not as a particular chronological moment, but as a conjuncture of infrastructure building projects. Now that comes to light in that little landscape that she drew for Feral Atlas. That kind of work that designers are able to do to uproot certain kinds of business as usual assumptions and push us to see form in a different way seems to me incredibly important and exciting for interdisciplinary work these days.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, thank you. I have the courage now.
Great.
Excellent talk, thank you, both of you, FEIFEI and Anna. Just as you were talking about, I mean, in your talk, my mind was racing, and I think this might be an interesting way, back to Eric's question, what is the potential function in designers and anthropologists interacting? Because as a designer, as you were talking about the ghost form and the double death, which is so striking as, you know, two concepts, when architects draw wall details, we draw it as though they are sandwiches, layers of material, right? Obviously, I'm doing this with my hand right now because, you know, these are vertical layers of material, one of which might be a vapor barrier or so on and so forth. But the horizontal weave that prevents, it's almost a stifling layer of fabric, you know, and this kind of weave dotted by the tree trunks that might be looked at read as tufts to a, you know, sofa surface. I'm just starting to kind of think about the differences of scales and how one might be able to read this horizontal landscape as a very thick wall, and in what ways might we want it to fail, right? Like when we design walls, we don't want the walls to fail, but in this case, we kind of want things to be permeable. And so anyway, I just want to offer this back, wondering what an anthropologist and what other experts might be thinking with this type of designer thinking information. But I also wanted to maybe respond to what Eric was saying, which is the word invisible. What I also found really striking was that maybe a way in which a designer would think is to be able to turn on or off certain layers that are actually visually impenetrable, meaning things are underground, but once you draw it and you turn off the set layer, you could see it. Which also harkens back, I think, to Dr. Bieman's super beautiful presentation in the first round, where I think the DNA becomes a translucent fabric. Much in a similar way, I think the ghost form is also a translucent fabric. I just find the whole thing very beautiful, so thank you.
Great, thank you. FEIFEI or Anna, did you want to respond at all?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. I think I have the privilege of being able to collaborate with Anna and Anna's other colleagues in UCSC. Is that something I feel like sometimes architects are not being able to or cannot afford to do, which is spending years in a site and carry out empirical research. and that level of knowledge and observations and discovery sometimes get lost in when architects do a side research, which spend about a few days or a week. So I think there is this kind of scale jumping now because, again, going back to that kind of satellite imagery or Google map is everything's captured from a very kind of single perspective, from a plan view, and is momentary too. Whereas spending a kind of a spread of time and being able to actually spend on site and listening to the local narratives and having conversations with people help us to observe this kind of evolving forms that sometimes designers just cannot quite observe. I can see Anna's trying to say something. Oh, there's another thought of the drawing, and I'm not really against drawings in whichever formats and whichever methodology, but by kind of drawing the wall as if it's straight line sandwiches is actually start to kind of idealize what the role of architecture is. Because the wall is not quite straight like that. It's never going to be perpendicular. And the sandwich is never going to be kind of evenly spread. And that's where the gaps happen. Sometimes the pipes have a bird nest into it and all kind of reactions get rid of it. Whereas sometimes these kind of gaps and these non-perfections allow space to evolve in kind of unexpected way. And I think to embrace this unexpected aspect or uncontrollable aspect into spatial intervention is perhaps something it will be very, very critical and interesting to explore in the future.
Maybe I'll just say one thing about the very wonderful imagery of letting things be seen that aren't otherwise seen, but then tracing back again, because I do think that work between designers and those who are doing empirical research on the world is great for showing kinds of visualization where some of those ghost forms can come through. I had the pleasure of the film that we saw earlier this afternoon about the Mugomo fig tree, that the roots give rise to springs because of the ways that they funnel water underground. I mean, just to think of that as a potential subject through which designers might think about some of that underground ghost form would be really delightful to me, so that we can not just talk about it, but begin to visualize what some of those root and water connections might look like.
Sorry, that's actually a good point that Anna mentioned about roots again, because sometimes during architectural project, we say within 10 meters you cannot dig in the ground because there's protected trees, but somehow, or actually outside that kind of periphery we've set, it's okay to dig however you want. Whereas the kind of relationship, the tree roots extend not only vertically but also horizontally. It's almost kind of like a three-dimensional space, and it has interactions with the fungi and the insects and the spores, and it formed this kind of in a range of this kind of multi-species being and relations that sometimes if you do just knock in underground and then put the foundations in, you destroy this kind of livelihood. So I think that's why the ghost forms are so important for us to intervene about how buildings actually interact this underground, not so easy to observe relationships that we might just destroy.
Great. Well, thank you, Fei. Okay. Okay.
Have you experienced any outcome of all the research? Some situation where your research is applied?
So the question was, have you experienced any outcome from your research yet that you could talk about?
I haven't, but I'm working on a project that's applying the Ferro Atlas kind of knowledge of thinking on a project and hoping to turn that into the beginning of the design intervention. Not to say becoming a precedence for anyone to look at, or not even for myself to look at, but even to prove how challenging it is even to applying these kind of multi-species perspectives into ways humans design and change the landscape is just experimentation on its own. And yeah.
Okay, well, can we give Ewan and Justin 30 seconds each, and then we'll probably have to close out.
I can leave with a comment on a question so it's quicker. I would say that, of course, there's been an outcome of your project because you have changed people's understanding of feral ecologies and the interactions. But my observation is maybe we should just reverse the sort of proposition about anthropologists working with designers, because actually it's far more important for designers to work with anthropologists, because fundamentally designers don't understand how ecology works, and that's a really big problem. So being able to observe natural systems and how ecology works is fundamental to being able to create the future of design that we need. So we have to learn from people like Anna and design methodologies that are derided to some extent, like things like permaculture, one of Australia's greatest design exports. People should look at permaculture, look at the systems that are messy design systems, because they're actually very, very rich territory.
Great, thank you.
Hello, Justin McGurk. I'd also like to thank you for that talk, because I think it was actually a very important talk, because what you've introduced, at least to me, is the importance of form in this new context. It's not new what you've said, because we've been dealing with the shift from the grid to the rhizome for, since the 90s at least. But what I think is new about what you're proposing is that we always saw those forms as kind of relational things relating to behaviors, complex systems. We never really saw them in aesthetic terms. We never really saw them as forms per se. And I think what you're proposing has real significance for the profession in terms of how we reconceive form and aesthetics. I'm not talking about a kind of surface aesthetics here, but a kind of a deep aesthetics, if you like. So I'm still digesting it and processing it, and will do for a long time, but thank you.
Well, FEIFEI, we spoke about this a little bit last night, where aesthetics comes in. Maybe do you want to just address that, and then I think Simone and Andrea are going to kill me if we don't bring it close to this. Yeah.
In terms of aesthetics of design,
or just aesthetics, from a in a philosophical sense, even.
Yeah, we spoke briefly last night about this kind of, are we creating beautiful visualizations that tend to romanticize the environmental issues of the Anthropocene? And then this kind of the aesthetics is not to kind of make the material beautiful. The aesthetics is trying to draw people's attentions into specific details that perhaps is so easy to ignore. Because when you look at a material, you tend to just kind of glance for a second. So I think that's what the aesthetic parts is helping us to try to kind of explain these very complex relationships in specific details.
Sure. Anna, I think you were, yeah.
Sure. I liked the last comment, because I think, at least in the social sciences, that move that the speaker was talking about has been often understood in relation to networks, which does get at the relational aspect, but ignores what you could call the morphology. That I don't know whether aesthetics is going to get us in the wrong direction, because think about beauty, but if you think about morphology, where the stuff is, what needs to be touching what, that we haven't paid enough attention to that morphology. And so that's what we're pushing here, is a kind of morphological way of understanding spatial relations. And one tiny comment about outcomes, I think the biggest outcome that we were aiming for with Feral Atlas is to get folks to work across these tremendously deep divides between natural scientists and humanists, artists and designers. We don't know how to work together, and on environmental problems, we're really sunk. if we can't figure out better ways to conceive problems together and to figure out what it is we want to see at a particular moment in our analysis. Thanks.
Can I quickly add one small comment on the outcome that I think Feralis also is an educational material that is open access, free to access. And I think education is also a critical outcome of the research project, is to teach people or future generations and perhaps the kind of new ways of learning to even see the world before they start to design for the world. So I hope that is that part of the outcome that we really hope to achieve through all the research work.
Sure, great. Great. Well, on that note, I mean, there's obviously, as always, a lot more that we can talk about. But as Faye said earlier, these are not questions that are going to be hashed out overnight, because essentially what we're talking about, I think, not just with your work, but this has been a thread throughout these 3 days, we're talking about sort of changing worldviews, and that really is not something that is done easily, but it's also perhaps not as hard as we think. I mean, this talk of ghost forms and more than human this and that, it probably sounds a little bit strange to a lot of people, but I think we need to remember that it perhaps isn't so strange, and not all of it is in fact so new, as Justin said. My institution, the New Institute in Rotterdam, one of our researchers developed a framework called the ZHOU, which, long story short, is a way of bringing non-human, more than human interests and voices into our organizational decision-making processes. And we actually adopted that a couple months ago. And when I talk about this to some audiences, people think it's a little bit weird. But last month I was in India talking about this, and people were like, yeah, and this is how we've been thinking for like millennia. So I think it's really great that we're able to really break open these conversations here now and to engage them more broadly with people from around the world. And again, we have to thank Simone and Andrea for having us all come together on behalf of Prada. So on that note, I think I will just turn it back to Simone for some final words. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, FEIFEI and Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you really a lot, FEIFEI, Anna, and of course ARIC. I mean, I really cannot think of a better way of concluding these 3 days. Me and Andrea, we will never think anymore about our name in the same way after today. It was really thrilling. And also I think it is incredible how this last session, but also all the contributions, really opened up so many possibilities for hopefully the future of any possibility that Prada Frames might come back, because I think the content that we put forward is, I think, incredible. We really hope this will continue. And of course, I would like to thank, because I didn't do that at the opening of the last session, Mrs. Prada, because she really supported truthfully this idea, and she really wanted to, that everything that was put forward would have been respected in the best way possible. So we really hope we managed to do that. Thank you also for all the listeners to sticking with us for all this time. Thank you.